Today on the Perception in Action podcast, my interview with Jia Yi Chow from Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, a look at nonlinear pedagogy. So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from ASU and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, my interview with Jia Yi Chow, we have a really fun conversation about nonlinear pedagogy. What exactly is it? What has research shown about its effectiveness? What are some of the challenges coaches and instructors face in using it? Also, before getting to the interview, I wanted to mention a blog post I recently put up on my website. It is an accompaniment to episode 192, where I compared and contrasted prescriptive instruction and self-organization approaches to coaching. In the post, I directly compared two training methods, one from each camp, for the same sports skill, correcting forearm flyout in baseball pitching. So please check it out at perceptionaction.com/connection ball if you're interested. Now on to the interview. So today my guest is Jia Yi Chow from Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Thanks for taking some time to talk with me.
Thank you, Rob. It's a pleasure and a privilege for me to come on board to chat with you. And I think I've mentioned before, I really appreciate the work that you've done in getting scientists, practitioners to come on board and talk about their work. So it's great, and I really appreciate what you have been doing.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that feedback and the compliment. That means a lot. And so to get us started, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got interested in what you were doing?
Sure. So I'm a teacher by training, a PE teacher. Mm-hmm. And I taught in the schools for a while, and I've always been interested in looking at how learners acquire skills and adapt skills. And that kind of got me going to think about, hey, look, how can I best help my students and my kids to better learn a game skill and apply it in a way that is meaningful for them. And that set me thinking about really looking a little bit more in terms of modal learning. And modal learning skill acquisition has always been an interest in my undergrad days. And I had the privilege of working with Bruce Abernathy, and he influenced my work greatly in terms of my thinking. And so I sought to look at, go on to do a PhD. And that's where I met Keith Davids and Chris Button. Mm-hmm. So they got me over to Otago, and it was such a wonderful experience there, working with both of them and beyond them as well, with other like-minded researchers, scientists in this area of work, people like Ian Renshaw, which has come on the show as well, and Duarte Arrojo as well. So I think these are really nice people that I've been able to work with. And I spent a couple of years, 3 to 4 years in Otago, and I did my PhD. I enjoyed my work with them, and eventually I went back to Singapore. I was initially a teaching fellow at Nanyang Technological University with the National Institute of Education. Mm-hmm. So I went back and I continued my work. And currently I am Associate Dean, looking after program and student development. So very much involved in teacher education now at this point in time, but always with an eye out still for modal learning, skill acquisition, and how do we make sense of the very challenging environment that our students have to work with, and our student teachers as well. How do they go about honing their craft and enhancing their craft and making learning, motor skills learning, as meaningful as possible. So I guess in short, that's kind of my journey, and that's where I am now.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I know, and obviously that's a really important issue for so many reasons, like setting people up for a healthy life beyond school and things like that. And I know, so one of the main main areas you work in, and you have a book you've written on nonlinear pedagogy.
Yeah, and that's right.
So maybe a brief for people what that is, and then when did you start with a more traditional linear approach to learning, motor learning, and then kind of switch, or kind of what path did you follow that way?
It's a great question, Rob.
Yeah.
When I was in my undergrad days, when I was preparing to be a teacher, typically then there was a lot of directed instructions, kind of more linear type of repetition, drills, consistency, focusing on movement form, and that was very much a part of my training and preparation, in terms of how I perceive teaching and learning. But I was, I guess, uncomfortable, and I thought there must be a better way of maybe doing this. When I see my students and even myself struggling when I try to replicate certain specific movement cues or movement forms shared with me, I say, look, well, it's tough, if I have to replicate that specific movement form in a game context. And as we know, right, the game is so dynamic. It's never exactly the same, and we need to be a little bit more adaptable. And how do we make that transfer from practice to performance a little bit more meaningful and more constructive and more effective, basically?
Mm-hmm.
So that set me thinking. And as I mentioned earlier on, I was then had the opportunity to work with Keith Davids and Chris Button, and I remember the very first couple of months when I was there, and I shared with them. I said, look, my background is in teaching and games teaching, and I at skills acquisition, and I always kind of struggle. And when I spoke with them and I started to get into looking at dynamical systems theory and ecological psychology, and then of course eventually ecological dynamics, I thought, wow, that's kind of amazing theoretical framework for me to underpin some of my thoughts in terms of how we think learning should be happening.
Mm-hmm.
How it's amazing, man, looking at not just the individual existing on their own, but the learner environment mutuality. I think that's so critical. Mm-hmm. And I think while it's intuitive, but yet strangely enough, many practitioners do not see that connection as so critical and tend to then view the individual as the person in silo working on his or her own. Mm-hmm. And that was when I had this long chat with Keith Davids and Chris Button as well. And that was when we actually wrote the first paper on kind of nonlinear pedagogy and looking at how if we think learners behave in a nonlinear way, mm-hmm. we see so much nonlinearity in learning. And we really look at some form of pedagogical approach to account for such nonlinearity. I think that was what triggered the whole discussion, and that was how it set the ball rolling for me to get into this whole idea of a pedagogical approach, mm-hmm. A nonlinear pedagogical approach to account for all this kind of nonlinearity that we see. Mm-hmm. We see people showing different individualized movement forms. We see sudden change behaviors, and we feel certain instructions or task goals and concepts and ideas from ecological dynamics, dynamical systems theory were a lot more relevant to how I thought about how we should be learning skills. So that kind of set the ball rolling for how I got into this whole idea about nonlinear pedagogy. And I must stress it's all the different discussions and sharing and argument and debates with my peers and with Chris, Keith, Ian, and Duarte, and the rest, Ludovic Seifert as well, where we started to see, hey, look, I mean, there's really quite a lot of value in how maybe we should think about a specific or different types of pedagogical approach, to perhaps share with our peers and our mm-hmm. colleagues in the same area of work. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. Yeah. So it sounds like you were already doing some things and it kind of fit with what you were already doing and thinking. Yes. Yeah. So maybe get like how the nonlinear. So I know a lot of people, some of the issues, I know you've written about this, the kind of the nonlinear versus games, kind of just a games-based approach. Obviously, it's more to it than that. Yes. So maybe what description would you use for what nonlinear pedagogy is? If you had to do a really, yeah.
I get asked this question a lot, and I guess my peers
it's I know
exactly. Yeah. What exactly is nonlinear pedagogy? What is it? What exactly is it? I think, as I mentioned to you, I think in one of the papers in 2011, Keith and myself and a few others wrote. And we highlighted how, as I mentioned earlier on, we see a lot of non-linearity in behaviors in skill acquisition and skill learning. So, for example, non-proportionality. How we see when you practice X amount of time doesn't mean that you will also increase or perform X amount of level of performance. Maybe slight tweaks and slight changes in the way you train or you practice, and you see huge increases, or maybe there could be some regressions as well. We really don't know. So it's non-proportional, and we see that inherently in a lot of practice environments. We see multi-stability, right? We see multiple ways of people achieving the same outcome, and even the same person. Could be different ways of doing it, under different contexts, and different environment, and different constraints. We also see how when we scale different parameters in a learning context, like, for example, we scale the different areas of dimension of a play, and we see different behaviors. Passing becomes a lot more attractive, or maybe taking the ball and dribbling maybe a little bit more challenging when we scale the size of the playing area. When we scale the length of a racket, we see different behaviors coming about. Scale the size of the ball as well. So we see this kind of effect on scaling and on what we call perhaps adjusting the control parameters. And we see different behaviors emerging. And we see the functional role of noise as well, variability in practice. The variability affords the exploratory behaviors of the learners. So we see all this actually quite as typical in learning contexts. And as I mentioned earlier on, if we do see these behaviors, these non-linearity behaviors, could we then really think about how we teach and how we help our learners learn better, and especially when they display such behaviors? Should we look at some pedagogical approach to account for this? So what are some of the pedagogical principles or design principles perhaps that we can put in place to help support the learners learn in such a way? So that was how nonlinear pedagogy came about. It is to account for this nonlinearity. So that's why we term it as nonlinear pedagogy. And some of the design principles, as I alluded to earlier on, pertains to, again, I think it's been covered quite comprehensively in a lot of the literature now, representativeness, right? Making sure that there is representative learning design there, so that the information that's available in the environment is more aligned to how the learners may actually use that information to directly influence and guide their action. The kind of information that helps build functional affordances, like, for example, in a game setting or in any practice conditions where it mimics the kind of information that should be available in those contexts. And I talked about constraints manipulation as another design principle. I think constraints manipulation is actually very much aligned to all other things, right? Like you can manipulate tasks, you can take into account environmental constraints, now performer constraints. I think constraints manipulation is obviously very critical and obviously related to the other design principles as well. And I think that's one aspect where we need to be a little bit more explicit in terms of helping the practitioners to understand, and maybe researchers as well to understand, hey, you can, alter and review and revise constraints in a way to shape behaviors. So I think that's another one for us to think about. And the other one is looking at not focusing on task decomposition, but rather more on task simplification if we can. Again, that's also about keeping that perception action coupling tight. I think that's always something that is a crux in terms of how we view learning, in terms of making sure that that perceptual action relationship is always kept intact. So task simplification, obviously, I think allows for that to occur. Think about simplifying the task, but rather than making it into its parts and decomposing it so that it doesn't make sense. I think task simplification is something that we always think about as well. And the other principle that we talked about within nonlinear pedagogy is really looking at probably be a little bit more sensitive to how informational constraints are presented to learners. Informational constraints pertaining to, for example, do we focus a lot more externally, or do we focus a lot more internally? Do we focus a lot more on the movement form, or should we focus more on the effect or the movement outcome. So I think it's been quite a lot of work in that area as well. Obviously from Gabriel Wolf's team, and also Rich Masters looking at implicit learning, and I think analogy learning as well. I think there's obviously quite a lot of connections, alignment to that as well. And I think the underpinning idea is if you focus more on external or focus on movement effect or movement outcome, it kind of allows for more subconscious control of movement, and I think that's critical. So again, I guess it's important for practitioners and researchers to think a little bit more about that, to be a bit more sensitive to how, when we present informational constraints, whether it's internal or external, whether it's movement form or movement effect, the kind of implications that it has on the learner. So I think that's something to think about as well. And of course, the last one that we kind of mentioned would be the functional role of variability. And I think I mentioned earlier on as well, that variability in practice is, again, critical for exploratory behavior. I think if we allow for that kind of variability to be present in practice conditions as well, then perhaps we are able to encourage learners to perhaps explore different ways of moving and explore ways that are maybe individually meaningful, for the learner himself or herself, and the exploratory behavior is critical. So those are some of the key design principles that we put in place to account perhaps for the non-linearity that we see. And in the middle of it all, center of it all is obviously the learner, and the constraints-led approach is captured within that framework as well, understanding that task, environment, and performer relationships in terms of the interactions, making sure that we are aware that whatever goal-directed behavior that we see, at the end of the day, is the consequence of the interactions among all the different constraints there. And the way then we design the practice through looking at some of these design principles, can we help to shape, channel, and encourage our learners towards perhaps certain goal-directed behaviors, their own goal-directed behaviors, to meet certain task goal in practice context, for example. And of course, I think the design principles work through the pedagogical channels of practice and information.
Yeah.
So I think those are the key things that we try to capture within a nonlinear pedagogy framework. But again, as I mentioned, I think it's always developing as well. I mean, new ideas coming in, shaping our thoughts and how we see nonlinear pedagogy, and also input from other colleagues from around the world. And as we also see people moving and working in this area, it gives us new ideas as well, and perhaps even some blind spots that we have not been aware of, and say, look, wow, maybe we didn't see it that way, and we would maybe need to clarify some of the thinking as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. I like the way you describe that as, nonlinear pedagogy as a way to describe what we were observing, like to fit what you're observing in terms of, non-linearities in the way people learn skills. There's so many things that it kind of, we have like deliberate practice where we see kind of this skill is a perfect relationship with number of hours of practice, which on the average maybe, but not for individuals. I think you're right at talking kind of the, practice is like a dose response curve. You add a little bit more and you get this little change where like you said, sometimes you add a little bit more and you get a massive complete shift in. And the other thing I think that I'm sure you is the rejection of kind of the stage that learning, like, so that you have to learn technique first, then you put the technique in context to make decisions, then you try to adapt, right? That you kind of reject the idea that you have to follow this kind of linear stage automaticity, you know what I mean? Kind of things. Yeah. So I think there's lots of ways it's nonlinear, right? So in terms of the work you've done, what have you found the effectiveness of kind of using these nonlinear approaches to compare to traditional approaches?
Again, another very good question. Obviously, at a personal level, I've been doing some work in Singapore with schools and teachers as well. So we've gone into the schools to help our teachers to be familiar with what nonlinear pedagogy is and what are some of the design principles. And then we work together with them in a specific research project to see that when you teach a class using nonlinear pedagogy ideas compared to a class where you use a linear pedagogy ideas, what is the impact? What are the outcomes? So again, very blessed here that we've been able to be supported by some of these research grants coming through the university and from the ministry as well to do some of this work. So we have found, I think again, in some of your previous episodes, I believe there was a mention of a piece of work by Lee and colleagues, which is Miriam, which is one of my PhD students, and she did a piece of work where we went into the schools and we worked with children in the schools, about 10 years of age, really sharing with the groups nonlinear pedagogy intervention and then another group linear pedagogy intervention. And what we found was those that were in the nonlinear ones, they actually demonstrated a more varied and diverse movement solutions to solve the movement problem of trying to hit a modified tennis forehand ground stroke, as compared to a linear group where they were trying to just mimic and follow a specific movement form. And in terms of performance outcome, both groups were just as good. They had improvements post intervention. But what was interesting for us was the learning process itself. How the kids and the learners from the nonlinear pedagogy group actually showed and demonstrated many more different movement forms and movement solutions. So there could be more ways that they are able to explore and use that is meaningful for themselves, as compared to only a one optimal way. So that was something that we found, and I thought it was interesting. And even in terms of retention, we also found that the nonlinear one had pretty good retention, whereas the linear one, interestingly, they kind of reverted to their own way of doing it and kind of not follow what was shared with them in terms of the specific cues. So that is an interesting finding that we reported. And that was really working with kids in the school during their PE classes, working with teachers on the ground. And we went in and we actually went through every lesson plans with them. We sat down, we ran workshops with the teachers, and we basically supported the teachers in terms of teaching linear and nonlinear approaches. So we had follow-up projects from there, and we worked with larger classes at secondary school level, age of about 13 to 14 years old, on territorial games as well. And again, we also found quite similar reports and findings where kids in the nonlinear group tend to also show more ways of passing and receiving, as compared to a linear approach way. So they were really harnessing and really, I think, using their own individualized constraints and matching it perhaps to the performance, the task constraints and stuff, to find our own ways of doing it. And when we sat down with them and we had qualitative work in terms of interviews and focus group discussions, again, it was very exciting and interesting for us to hear them speak about, my teachers don't tell me exactly how to do it, but it's really nice for me to try my own ways, and I have the freedom to do different things, and then I could use different equipment, and I work together in groups, and it's real, I feel like I can really use this in a game, and then all those things came out quite strongly as well. Whereas the linear group was like, yes, I've got to repeat this. I know these cues specifically. I'm just going to follow them. I'll memorize these cues. I'm just going to replicate it. But it's not so interesting for me. So we see those things coming out very clearly when we speak to the students, and even when we speak to the teachers. We thought we had another intervention where we had teachers teach fundamental movement skills, throwing and catching, to young kids. Class, and I hear from the teachers, those who they had to teach both linear and nonlinear. When they were teaching the nonlinear for the first 2 weeks, they were very concerned. I said, I'm not sure if it's working because it's taking a lot of time, and I can't go in and tell the kids exactly what to do. Are the kids learning? Are the kids progressing? What if they are ever never able to throw? And those are very real concerns and real fears of the teachers using methods of nonlinear pedagogy, because we provide autonomy to the kids we are designers of practice. We are taking a step back. We are trying to withhold that urge to go in and give very prescriptive instructions, which many practitioners would want to do it because of time, and because we need to be seen as being the authority here and with knowledge and with all the ideas and experiences that we should be the one with the guardian of all knowledge, and we should go in there and tell them exactly what to do. And the teachers have that concern. But third, fourth, fifth week onwards, wow, I saw that transition, and I saw that jump, and I saw that the kids could actually do it, without me having to prescribe exactly how they should. And that kind of allayed their fears. I know that there was a very strong urge to get in there and say, I need to tell them exactly how to do it. And I think that was something that was interesting. It was interesting for us to talk about at the end of the whole intervention and the whole study. But of course, I think it depends on the level of comfort level of the teachers themselves. Some come with very strong disposition to say, I need to get in there and tell them exactly what to do. And some feel that maybe a hybrid of some form of prescriptive instructions together with a bit more nonlinear pedagogy approach could work. So these are ideas that's been shared as well with us. So we are always learning as well when we are in the schools doing empirical work, and we see some of these results coming through, and we see and we hear some of this feedback coming as well. And of course, we get the quantitative data as well that tells us what works and what doesn't work. I think that gives us some form of affirmation as well, and endorsement about what we believe would work. But like I say, it's always work in progress. And it's also exciting for us to then read about other people who are doing this kind of work as well, and using nonlinear pedagogy as a framework when they go in and do some of these empirical studies, which we have no contact with. They are using some of these thoughts and ideas, and it's really exciting for us and for me to read some of those work and to see how they went about to do some of those studies and intervention, task constraints that they use, and do a bit of a comparison between what they are doing and what we do, and say, wow, okay, this is interesting and exciting, and I think it's a collective effort from people who are interested in this area of work, where they start getting into this kind of empirical studies, and it helps to build the knowledge. It helps to build that base and knowledge in terms of what could work, what doesn't, why does it work, and why does it not, and what is the way forward. I think that, to me, moving ahead for the next 5-10 years, I see as perhaps an area of work that we see would be coming through a lot more, and I think would be very valuable to help inform us of our own thinking behind nonlinear pedagogy.
Yeah. No, I think those are great points. And I really like that tennis study. I think one of the challenges, I have the same thing as starting to do some of these kind of studies, is the way that you assess learning is way more difficult if you believe in nonlinear pedagogy, right? We can't just do a whole bunch of means and then a t-test, right?
It doesn't work. It doesn't work. We need to go to the individual level, looking at changes.
But and I like that study, the different techniques. And I'm sure, maybe if you did something, everyone always gives you suggestions after a study, but if you did something like a transfer condition to a different court type or something, you might expect the nonlinear group to really show there.
So, exactly. So I think obviously the next few pieces of work will be looking at transfer between games in the same category, for example. Like if it's net barrier game, if we do tennis, if we do, badminton, is there some transfer there? Is there something in there that allows a nonlinear group that transfer of learning a lot easier? So, I mean, those are the areas of work that we could look at, obviously.
Yeah, no, and I think the other point I found really interesting, you're talking about the coaches the teachers getting used to doing it and resisting the urge to jump in. And you mentioned you're doing education. So, I imagine, you doing this approach is quite a skill that you have to develop as a coach, right? Being able to do constraints effectively. And so kind of how do you develop as a coach using this approach? What kind of have you found? Is there a way people can improve in their ability to use constraints and nonlinear approaches? And I think you've already probably talked about it, comparing notes and seeing what does work, but is there, what have you found in that way?
I think what is critical is, and I shared in one of my paper as well, was that one of the challenges is for practitioners to actually be very, very comfortable and knowledgeable and then experienced in their own sports, because then they would know exactly really what kind of constraints they should be tweaking and designing, what kind of practices. Because if you don't know your sports and your game and your activity well enough, you will not be able to make relevant and meaningful changes. You're not able to channel your learners towards certain task goal. So I think that expertise, that level of knowledge, experience, working within your own sports and game, I think that is very critical. When you have that, you can more easily, during any practice context, identify moments where, hey, look, okay, I think I need to design this a little bit differently. I need to channel them to look at some things a little bit differently. And even at the onset, you are probably a lot more clearer in terms of how you should design certain practices, so that if there's a certain task goal that you want to achieve at the end of the session, there's clarity, and you expect perhaps individuals to maybe demonstrate slightly different behaviors, and you expect maybe a series or a diverse range of behaviors as well. Again, I think, but that comes obviously with the premise that the practitioner, the coach, the teacher must have that level of experience and skill, in terms of knowing the game well enough to manage those constraints manipulation effectively. So I think that's one challenge, to be able to know. And I think for me, in my work in teacher education, as I prepare PE teachers, not every one of them are familiar with all the games, right? So some games are a little bit less familiar for them. So I think that's where, when you see that they are less familiar with a particular game, I think they struggle a little bit in terms of how they manipulate those constraints, and they may not understand why, when they tweak those certain task constraints, when you change the rules in a certain way, what is the meaning behind it? Why do they think that it works that way or not? So I think that is really one big piece. But I guess also some coaches and some teachers and practitioners out there perhaps have already been doing some of these things, that we talked about in nonlinear pedagogy in their own ways, but maybe not see it as nonlinear pedagogy, or they could be doing something that maybe is a hybrid, or maybe whatever works for them. And they take it, and then they take it and run with it. But when I work with the National Sports Association here as well, and when I run workshops for them, and when I work with some of the coaches, I highlight, these are the reasons why, and these are the design principles behind it. And I share with them, and say, wow, okay, it's actually quite intuitive for them. But yet, then they now realize the reasons behind it, and then they understand why now that it works, because of the things we spoke about. Constraint-led approach, interactions among constraints, idea of affordances, self-organization, and of course, for me to explain what self-organization is to them, it can be a challenge. And also try to break it down and make it easy, and look at, we see goal-directed behavior because the learner doesn't exist by himself or herself. There's always this mutuality with the environment. So I think they begin to see that, okay, I need to maybe broaden my scope a little bit, and that's where they begin to understand, and they feel affirmed in some ways that wow, what they've been trying to do, has some grounding, and there is a real reason for them to continue to explore and try some of these ways of doing things and designing practices as well. So I think, and of course for me at my institute, when I prepare teachers as well, I role model it. So when I teach practical classes, I demonstrate it, and I show it, and I take them through the whole course using ideas in nonlinear pedagogy. And every time I do something, I say, look, this is how we make this representative. So when I do something like this, I say, look, this is how we simplify the task. When I give instructions, I say, no, did I tell you exactly how to do it? No, I didn't, right? I only tell you perhaps what an outcome could look like. And these are ways that I infuse it, and I demonstrate it, and I role model it, so that eventually when they become teachers out in the schools, they can then think about using these ideas too. So I think these are different ways that I do it. I work with the ministry as well. I run workshops for them. I give talks, and I try to work. And because over a period of time, I've got a number of PhD students who are out in the schools as teachers as well. They begin to then form communities of practices, and begin to share some of this work with the teachers in the school. And I think that's how we help to share more and to talk more on this, and so the different ways of doing it.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. I think, you're right. In context, learning. And I also, I think there's a point there that I kind of try to make too. And sometimes you're right. Coaches are it's very intuitive. They're doing very similar things already. But I think understanding the principles allows you to expand on it. And I often use the analogy, you can have, as a coach, you can just have some recipes, right? You just learn this drill. It works. Or you can be a cook. Like, you can understand, if I tweak this little ingredient, because you understand why it worked, you're right. You can expand into different areas.
They should come up with their own recipes.
Yes, exactly.
That's most important. Design their own practices rather than, follow certain practices that they think works. But I think we want to provide the autonomy to the coaches and the teachers. Again, that's why, we talk about nonlinear pedagogy. We are not saying that you have to use all the design principles, at one setting or one go. It's broader than that. It's broader than games teaching. You think about all skill acquisition context or skill adaptation context. What kind of design principles do you think work for you there? And I think that's where the autonomy, and I think the meaning, to make meaning for the teachers to see themselves, coaches as well, to see themselves as designers of practice. We talk a lot about that as well. That they don't have to follow a specific cookbook style, right? To say I need to follow this specific recipe, but go beyond that, and be thinking practitioners. I think that's important.
Yeah,
that's where we are going.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's a lot more fun too for everyone.
Definitely.
Yeah. But later, I wanted to ask you. You had the second edition of your book, your great book, The Dynamics of Skill Acquisition, come out, I think, just a little while ago. I talked to Chris a little bit about some of the new things. Right. What are there some new things related to nonlinear pedagogy from the first edition that you've added?
Yes, I think I think that when the first edition came out, again, there was Keith, Chris, and Simon Burnett. I think that was when nonlinear pedagogy was just trying to it was still at its infancy, I guess. So there was some mention of it within the book, but in the second edition, we really had at least a chapter really on nonlinear pedagogy, specifically to talk about it. And I think many of the things I mentioned earlier on were captured within it as well. And of course, really from the last couple of years work within nonlinear pedagogy, we have also incorporated that in the book as well. And what to me was exciting for me when we started to work on this book was to help readers to make sense of what nonlinear pedagogy is. I think that's important, and also to help bridge that theory practice link. Where yes, you know what nonlinear pedagogy, but what does it mean for you if you want to practice or use it? So we gave a lot more examples, practical ideas and applications in terms of how this could work for you. So I think Chris was very cognizant of that and very intentional to say, look, I think we need to make it a lot more relevant and make it also easy for practitioners to understand and to be meaningful for them to use some of these ideas as well. So I think that's where we were very intentional, a lot more in the second edition to work on that as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, that's really great. I know that's something he emphasizes as well. So you don't have this huge, long bunch of pages of theory before you get to the actual examples.
Yeah. So when do we get to the application? Get
to a bit quick. I guess the last question I have for you, you mentioned a little bit about kind of with the current work that you have going in this area. You mentioned you're doing a lot of education things. Are you still doing kind of any research and writing in this area? What do you have going on now?
Yeah. So yes, I have, and I think one area that, and you actually mentioned very briefly earlier on, is about how do we assess nonlinear pedagogy? How do we assess learners in a practice context? And that's an area of work that I'm kind of getting into now, really looking at perhaps we know assessment shapes behaviors. If we still assess our children in a certain linear way, even with the best of intention of practitioners and coaches and teachers, they may have to then revert back to some sort of a linear way of teaching because you are assessed that way. I mean, the students are assessed that way.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps then there isn't, or there's less room for maybe nonlinear pedagogy during the practices itself, because at the end of the day, if a kid is judged or assessed based on the specific form of throwing or kicking, then it doesn't quite align itself.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's where I'm looking. That's one area of what I'm looking at, and also maybe also to look at the current behaviors of teachers in the school, and what is the amount of non-linearization, I could call it, in the school, What is the amount in there, Is there a high proportion of teachers doing some of this stuff already?
Mm-hmm.
Or is there still a lot of maybe repetition drills, focus on movement form itself? I think it's good to do a stock pick in that sense to see what is happening. And then maybe think about how can we increase that proportion in terms of the nonlinear pedagogy approach in there, and if we want to think about how can we increase that, then perhaps how do we go about helping other teachers to do that as well? What needs to be put in place as support structures, whether there could be different ways of us preparing teachers, coaches, okay? Whether there could be different ways of looking at assessment. Can we look at the assessment rubrics for the different game skills or FMS, for example? I think if we tweak the assessments, there would be a strong possibility of better tweaking the pedagogical approach to working with the children in the schools and the learners as well. I think, as I mentioned, assessment shapes behavior.
No, I think that's really important. That you're totally right. That assessment piece, I think is critical for research side as well. But you're right. I think in getting people to adopt it and stuff. So that was really great. I really enjoyed that. Thanks for taking some time to talk with me.
Thank you, Rob. I really enjoyed it. As I mentioned, I think you're doing great work, and yes, I think just keep at it, Rob. I mean, I really appreciate it. And again, thanks once more for having me on board for this particular session, and I look forward to following your podcast as well as we go on.
Thanks again for the great discussion, Jia. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.